Welcome to this lecture on part 3 of Gerald of Wales's History and Topography of Ireland. It's got a playful title that explains it, Gerald's History of the Irish People. So my bottom line is that he goes to the country in a spirit of confirmation bias, looking for evidence of their depravity, i.e. their wretched behavior and bad nature, thus to justify English conquest of the country. Gerald's task, how to describe the Irish people and their history, which is really the central matter of part 3. In parts 1 and 2, we saw Gerald trimming a narrow line, so he's walking a tightrope, so to speak. He has to make Ireland sound worthy of conquest while still marginalizing it. So we know that the country, it has sweet air, it has no poisonous animals. We have some legends involving animal behavior. For example, like the wolves, who are secretly very pious. Another one with St. Kevin and the blackbird, who makes a nest in his hand. So yeah, it has a lot of things to recommend it. Yet it also has a few really strange things, and as Gerald hints and even sometimes argues, these point out, direct our attention onto Irish depravity, so their wretched and perverse behaviors. So we have the Oxman of Wicklow, the woman with the beard and mane down her back, and the woman who has the bestial relationship with the goat. I feel like all of these were sort of bunched together in his text in part 2. In part 3, we see him wrestle with a different task. So now he really does home in on speaking to the Irish people themselves more directly. He has to explain away Ireland's reputation as the Isle of Saints and Sages, which it already had at this point in history, while also finding grounds for dismissing it and thus making them sound incapable of handling their own affairs, as well as being in need of English custodianship. Let's consider a bit of cultural context. 12th century Ireland. Some of this is familiar to you already from previous lectures, as well as the introduction to your Gerald of Wales text. In 1154, Pope Adrian IV, who was the only English pope even to this day, he hands Ireland over to England for the Irish people's spiritual welfare, and the papal bull's title, I love it, is Laudabiliter, most praiseworthy. And he goes on to describe this transaction that's going to happen in order to benefit the Irish people's spiritual welfare. But they had been a thorn in the church's side, or I'd say more particularly the church as it existed in Rome, even particularly the papacy, for many centuries. So in the year 664, there was a synod called the Synod of Whitby that clarified when Easter should be celebrated. So England, like Ireland, was out of step with this. The Roman practice of when Easter was celebrated, they celebrated it on a different weekend. And as I've said before, Easter falls on the first Sunday after the first full moon of the spring equinox. And so here we have geographic differences suggesting that Easter should be held at a different time, because that point in the year is going to be different around different parts of the globe. So that is to say that popes for centuries had been wanting to clamp down on Ireland because their religious customs were different. So Easter is a good example, and a lot of them would seem very nitpicky to us. So it's whether monks wear that characteristic haircut where the top of their head is shaven bald or not. A lot of them really suggest heavy nitpicking. So we do have then, subsequent to this act on the part of Adrian IV, and probably in cooperation with it, the Normans invade Ireland in 1169 and oust the native ruler, the High King, so the last High King of Ireland, Rory O'Connor, they had ruled Gaelic Ireland, and yeah, historical chronicles of them, kind of like many that stem from the Middle Ages, include a mix of historical and mythological information. So I'll give you at least a couple of examples of that in this lecture. So Ireland isn't really even Ireland as we know it per se today. It is a conglomerate of different kingdoms, and the High King doesn't rule over them the way, let's say, the president rules over the 50 United States, and so there are local state interests and then a centralized government. It's really more that they pay tribute to this High King for some kind of protection against invading tribes, because this is the sort of culture that we're living with. So really, 12th century invasion of Ireland is its own quote-unquote Norman conquest of sorts, as the Normans themselves are ruling England. So this is almost like a more westward push on the part of the Normans, who've relatively recently, just 100 years before, invaded England. So thinking about this regime change when the High Kings of Ireland no longer ruled and were replaced by a British form of sovereignty, I couldn't help but reminisce about a movie that I saw when I was young and living in Dublin called The Last of the High Kings, starring Jared Leto as the hero of the story. I don't know if he does anything heroic, but we follow his hero's journey in this non-literary text. So yeah, I rewatched it recently, just trying to remember what it was about, and it does exist in the United States, even on YouTube, under the terrible title Summer Fling. But yeah, I don't know. It's probably like a B- movie. I don't know that I'd recommend it per se. It's very, very silly, but also quite substantial too, and smart. And it does appeal to this mythological, nostalgic sense of the past, where certain characters who are Irish, you think about what they've lost and kind of like what slipped through their fingers many centuries before, and how they might recuperate it. But is it a past that A, is retainable, and then B, were the good old days really all that good? So that's one of the messages in this text. So if you fancy these actors, you might give this movie a chance. What Gerald harps on. So I've divided Gerald's complaints into three different categories that I think sum up a lot of what he has to say about the Irish people. So the first being the Irish People's Report Card, A's and F's. So I'll speak more to each of these in greater detail. The Irish people's natural depravity, and then Ireland as the Isle of Saints and Sages, not. He debunks their legendary association with pious living. What I have there then is just a little blurb about Brian Boru, in particular a harp that has been associated with him. So Brian Boru is living 100 some odd years before this Norman conquest of Ireland goes down, and he's perhaps the best known High King, one who legendarily promoted music, and in particular the harp, in that country. So this harp, even though it's called the Brian Boru harp, dates from a few centuries later, so couldn't have possibly been his. But again, he had such a storied association with this instrument, and his bringing music, enhancing music in Ireland, and thus the country's association with music. Gerald gives the Irish people major props for their musical abilities. So even in picking over that chapter for some passive aggressive comments, it's like, no, I think he really pretty solidly gives them an A in music class. So the Irish People's Report Card, A's and F's. Let's have a look at such a report in a passage on their physical appearance. So Gerald says, Moreover, I have never seen among any other people so many blind by birth, so many lame, so many maimed in body, and so many suffering from some natural defect. Just as those that are well formed are magnificent and second to none, so those that are badly formed have not their like elsewhere. And just as those who are kindly fashioned by nature turn out fine, so those that are without nature's blessing turn out in a horrible way. So I'll put a pin in a few of those ideas that he brings up. Nature's role in um, helping out the Irish people, or in making them be depraved and horrible. But here we can just see, yeah, when they're good, they're great. When they're bad, they are terrible. So I think this kind of comment like does two things in the reader's mind. Like, first, it puts the Irish people like on the margins. So if you picture, like, yeah, they're even when they're getting an A, they're on the margins. Even when they're getting an F, of course, then they're on the margins, kind of like those really strange beasts that live on the margins of the map. And then, since there isn't a continuum of behavior, like they don't have any B's and C's, we're more easily able to dismiss some of their high points. Like, okay, they're good at music, but so what? So really, it's quite a brain trick that he plays on his readers, that he programs us to think of them in terms of, like, quote unquote crazy extremes. Let's look a little bit more closely at what explains this marginal performance on the part of the Irish people. So in the chapter preceding this one, where he describes the wide range of physical body types of the Irish, some of them glorious and others sick and quote unquote misshapen, we've got a chapter, the nature, customs, and characteristics of the people. So it sounds like he's being unbiased, quote unquote fair and balanced. Here's a look at their report card. So they get an A in that nature, as if to prove what she could do by herself, she continually shapes and molds until she finally forms and finishes them in their full strength with beautiful upright bodies and handsome well-complexioned faces. So they've been dealt a good hand, quote unquote, won the genetic lottery, as one of my friends used to like to say about good-looking people. But then in that same chapter, I think all of these comments come after this. They get an F in these items. So how they care for their infants who are not even kept in cradles or properly bathed. And you could go through and pick your own favorite ones. I have just a handful here. Their fashion sense. So probably some of this detail is a little bit arcane to us, but he makes it sound like some things that you're supposed to wear on some parts of your body, they wear on a totally different part of their body. They don't have proper wool to make many colors of clothes other than black, and I'm kind of a goth chick, so that's fine with me. Their horsemanship, their battle gear or lack thereof, they go into battle completely naked. I couldn't help but think of the Norse practice of going quote unquote berserk, or if you say, oh yeah, everybody was going berserk in the mall at Christmas time trying to get their sales. It speaks to this style of frenzied fighting involving like a naked warrior. And yeah, their farming practices where they've got good land, but they don't know how to cultivate it. And I believe it's in the subsequent chapter, Gerald explains that many of them have not seen civilized practices or quote unquote what would have been at the time modern inventions. And so here are these two little naked guys rowing a small boat, and they're fascinated by some of the gear that the English people have. So yeah, I don't know whether the Irish guys are winding them up like just to make for a good story and pretending like they've never seen such magnificent instruments, but nonetheless, here is an image taken from your text from the original manuscript of Gerald of Wales. Two little naked guys in a boat, because they can't do any better, so says Gerald. I'll now turn to the second point that I said Gerald harps on, the Irish people's natural depravity. So let's unpack what this constitutes. And by depravity, I mean you're something that's really terrible and obscene, and even to the point of criminality. You might say like the depravity of a horrific crime that's gone down. Uh, Here he gets kind of meta and talks generally about all these things that he's witnessing while he's visiting the country. To such an extent does one seem here to be allowed to carry out whatever one desires. So natural through long usage have bad habits become. To such an extent are habits influenced by one's associates, and he who touches pitch will be defiled by it. So, broadly speaking, Gerald is invoking the relationship between nature and culture that I talked about a bit earlier this semester, or in this case, nature and nurture. So, as we saw with some of the preceding examples, nature had dealt the Irish people a good hand and given them good health and good forms, but then it's just the stuff that they do that not only bothers Gerald, not only is barbaric, a classic word used by imperialistic eyes to describe a cultural other. But Gerald says that it really has become ingrained as if it's a habit. So drawing from a previous lecture, I might say that Irish depravity, like from Gerald's point of view, of course, is not natural but naturalized. I obviously don't think that Gerald's allegations are completely true. But what he's doing is a bit subtler. He's trying to essentialize Irish inferiority. So if you were to think, well, Gerald, you just saw some random customs, and who knows if you got a complete picture of the country, and customs can change. Maybe you caught the Irish people on a bad day. He's saying that, yeah, it has kind of seeped into their very selves. So they got dealt a good hand by nature, but now they've just become bad. So essentialize is the word that I will use to describe his rhetorical technique. So to sum up, he says the Irish either choose to be disgusting, and it seems as if this free-for-all and if it feels good, do it kind of ethic governs their activity in this country. They've chosen it so often that, like Pavlov's dog, it's become ingrained in them. So if you're familiar with this experiment, Pavlov fed a dog, fed a dog, fed a dog, then feed a dog and ring a bell at the same time, and then just ring a bell, and the dog will salivate. So that behavior on the part of the dog is the salivation at the sound of the bell is not natural, it's naturalized. So it does just happen. Nobody commands the dog to do it per se, but the dog can't help itself because it's learned behavior. Thus, the Irish people have made themselves bad to the bone. They are, it's as if Gerald's saying, hey, I'm not the one who's saying they are inferior to the English people. They were dealt a good hand. They've made themselves that way. So it's a pretty dire look at this adjacent culture. So by now you must know that I like to have a little bit of fun. So here are a couple of examples of Pavlov's dogs. So I like to think that first one at the bottom, the first one that popped up, is more Gerald's view of the Irish. So a conventional take on Pavlov's dog, that he's been conditioned to hear, to salivate at the sound of a bell. So even there a little bit, although this experiment postdates Gerald by many centuries, like he does imply, yeah, in picking up these really terrible habits that they chose to pick up in the first place, but yeah, that they don't really have control over their behavior. And of course, that picture is also funny because dogs just love to go bananas when they hear the doorbell. I might say we've got something else going on in Gerald's text that depicted in that image of the dog, how the Irish view Gerald, that just having lived in Ireland for a bit, as I did when I was young, they do like to tell stories, and there is a robust literary tradition in Ireland. To this day, like in particular in the early 20th century, there's such a proliferation of wonderful Irish writers. So, here in some cases, are they telling him stories, and he is willfully misinterpreting them as true? So there we've got the top image there, a very different type of Pavlovian dog than we're used to thinking about. So Gerald's theory that the Irish have a natural depravity that they've picked up over many centuries of committing horrible deeds and having your sloppy and barbaric customs, I think that this helps explain his obsession with Irish sexual habits. So I really doubt that many of these allegations about women having sex with animals, for example, as he alleges earlier in the text, like they probably aren't true, but why use this as a smear tactic? So let's have a look at one such passage relevant to this idea from the last part of the book. He says, "And it is not surprising if nature sometimes produces such beings contrary to her ordinary laws when dealing with a people that is so adulterous, incestuous, unlawfully conceived and born outside of the law, and shamefully abusing nature herself in spiteful and horrible practices." So, a really complicated quote there, with nature, you're standing in for as a shorthand for sexual acts. So we saw nature earlier described as more like Mother Nature, who gave the Irish a good hand, gave them strong bodies and nice looking figures and faces. Here it's as if there's revenge on the part of nature because of these sexual crimes that the Irish people commit. So we see some of these manifest in a couple of strange animals that were the products of bestiality, but you're reading more deeply into this this passage and others that speak about the Irish people's strange sexual habits, and why he emphasizes these so much. In light of the association between sex and reproduction, it's almost like he's training us to think that, yeah, they have become genetically predisposed toward these perverse customs precisely because they have committed them so many times over so many generations. The third theme that Gerald emphasizes in his discussion of Ireland is its status as the Isle of Saints and Sages, and he's invested in debunking this reputation. Let's have a very brief look at how it came to get this reputation. I'm going to appeal to a book that I read when I was about y'all's age, or should I say a college age student, How the Irish Saved Civilization. The author Thomas Cahill spoke of the pivotal role of Irish monasteries in Western civilization. So this period would be before the year 1000, in those centuries when, for example, England is getting raided by the Vikings, and then there's all just different sorts of warfare going on, and places of learning are susceptible to raids and invasions and warfare because they are seats of wealth. And so there's a lot of cultural artifacts that are lost during these wars and sieges, but Ireland, geographically distant, so kind of insulated from this, so the benefits of being marginal. So the Irish had copied many texts in various languages, Christian and pagan texts both. I would say probably the preponderance at this time and place would have been in Latin. And as I've said before, Ireland did not require the Christian conversion that England did in the 6th century, thanks to Pope Gregory, so it's converted rather early in the game. And although Christianity was one of several religions there, for a while it took when it was introduced, unlike in England where it's introduced in the 1st or 2nd century, then it Christianity is made legal throughout the Roman Empire, which England was a member of in the early 4th century. But by the time the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes came from the continent, Britannia was observationally equivalent to a pagan country, such that they had a cultural simpatico between these Germanic tribes and the native British peoples. England is converted, as I say, around the same time as Ireland was, 1st or 2nd centuries, but they need this refresher course. So you've probably seen in Gerald's text that how good of a Christian or how pious you are, I mean, however you want to measure such a thing, that really is a yardstick that he uses, and that is not particular to him. So I mean, I would say, just looking at this from the cheap seats, the fact that Ireland is converted early and doesn't change its tune and resume its pagan ways, and then the fact that it has such a robust monastic tradition, that really does make a big contribution to cultural generally. Yeah, it seems like they have a claim to this status as being the Isle of Saints and Sages. Here is an example of an early monastic settlement that you can still see in Ireland, just outside of Dublin in the Wicklow Mountains. It was founded by St. Kevin in the 6th century. So recall, St. Kevin is the guy who had the bird nest in his hand and thus had a legendary association with the, I believe it was the blackbird in the last segment of the text that we read. Here we have, I'll use this fancy pen. Here we have a monastic city in this image right here. And yeah, of course, that's taken in the visitor center, but I didn't have another photograph that really got the full scope of what a robust place this was. I mean, I guess city is not too much of an exaggeration. And monasteries throughout the Middle Ages are often self-supporting and often seats of wealth. Many of them produce books, and being literate is really a high-level skill at this time and place throughout the Middle Ages. So, yeah, it really is no wonder. And here is a famous shot from the monastic settlement at Glendola, this ruined church that people today, scholars wonder, yeah, indeed, how big was this magnificent structure when it was fully put together before it fell into ruin. It really does suggest a very magnificent space. So maybe some of y'all have been to Glendola. It's a very popular tourist attraction, but I've been there and it's completely worth going to see. So, Gerald, the one thing that the Irish people might have gotten an A in, being the Isle of Saints and Sages, Gerald has to pick apart at this reputation. So he tries to dismantle its early association with monastic and thus religious culture. Simply put, their religious life is too heavily oriented around monasteries. So why is this a bad thing when, as Dr. Hayes said, monasteries help save civilization in that they are seats of culture and learning and textual preservation? So the alternative is preaching to the lay people, pastoral missions, being more like a quote-unquote a parish priest or a minister who works with quote-unquote average people, lay people. So your monks mostly lead an enclosed contemplative life. That is the word they would have used in the Middle Ages. So they mostly pray and study. And parish priests tend to their flocks. They've got a quote-unquote pastoral mission. The word pastor in Latin means shepherd. They lead the quote-unquote active life. So that's not to say that the monks aren't active, because they're working super hard. They get up in the middle of the night to pray. They pray 8 times a day. So it's not like they're being slackers lying around, but they're not really interacting with lay people. They are living a life of quiet study. So in chapter 105, Gerald says that the clergy are to blame, and so this image that he uses derives from the Latin word pastor, meaning shepherd. Whence it happens that they neither preach the word of the Lord to the people, nor tell them of their sins, nor extirpate, so that's rip out vices from the flock committed to them, nor instill virtues. So essentially, they do not disseminate knowledge among the quote unquote unwashed masses. So some esoteric details in the text that might have been lost on you as you were reading it. And a lot of them are very, very nitty gritty, but here is such a one that he harps on a few times, is the monastic code of silence. So let's have a look at this critique that he makes of monastic life. An innocent life without much speaking. So no matter how good you are, and you keep this vow of silence, does much damage by its silence as by its good example. So yeah, maybe you should hold your tongue. And throughout the Middle Ages, there's a lot of advice about keeping a pious and ethical tongue, like don't backstab, don't backbite, don't gossip, don't tell dirty jokes, don't swear, don't give into lascivious and lewd speech. But yeah, maybe if you're taking a vow of silence, you've tipped it too much in the opposite direction. So he goes on, the wolves have to be driven off by the barking of dogs and the staffs of the shepherds. So this image of a priest as a shepherd then expanded to include all of the other creatures in this habitat. So wolves are going to come and prey upon the sheep if something is not done. So here we've got barking of dogs, the staffs of the shepherd. So priests and clerical people who police their flock rather than just quote unquote hide away, take a vow of silence, and do nothing but study. And the contemplative life actually sounds quite nice and to me and like a lovely vacation. But Gerald has some qualms with it. So as I've said, there he's speaking to the monastic vow of silence that governed much of the monks' lives. So they don't disseminate religious advice on the ground, as I've said, to the unwashed masses. So here's an example of a quote that Gerald writes down that I feel like the Irish person who gives it to him is winding him up a bit. So I'll let you guys decide. Let me put it here for your review. From the Bishop of Cashel. It is true, he said, that although our people are very barbarous, uncivilized, and savage, I find it hard to believe that the bishop would say that about his own people, nevertheless, they have always paid great honor and reverence to churchmen, and they have never put out their hands against the saints of God. But now a people has come to the kingdom, so i.e. the British invaders, the Norman conquest that's come to Ireland, and is accustomed to make martyrs. From now on, Ireland will have its martyrs just as other countries. So what he's saying there is, yeah, that Irish Christian history isn't a very stormy one in that they don't have many martyrs. So if we think way back to the early church, the martyrs that are torn apart by lions in the amphitheater for the amusement of pagan emperors. So they don't have that kind of culture. And then they don't have much of a clash with local pagan culture such that Christians get martyred by pagan powers that be. So England does have a few, and then there are many more stories like that on the continent. But with Ireland, as the story goes, it was a pretty peaceful transition that you don't have this really nasty culture clash. And Gerald is allegedly holding this over their heads. So Ireland might say we're the Isle of Saints and Sages, and we glommed onto Christianity very, very early, whereas it was has a stormier trajectory in other countries. And Gerald says, what a shame you don't have martyrs as the ultimate in Christian examples for your people. As I've said, Gerald, so I kind of look at this quote sort of with a cocked eyebrow. He got some of his stories and sound bites from the native people, and maybe in some cases these were folk legends. So what to do, for example, with the woman who had a goat as a boyfriend, maybe we need to read that in terms of some deeper truth, or just as a folk story that local people knew not to be true. But Gerald says, aha, here's evidence of their depravity. In my humble opinion, if we look at this through the lens of conquered people, it sounds like the bishop, not like he's saying, yeah, now we're going to have stalwart Christians ready to die for the faith. You've brought real Christianity to the country. It's more like, yeah, now thanks to British involvement in our country, here comes trouble. Like, what a wonderful thing to bring to our country, the idea of martyrdom. Is that really something you need to brag about or push upon the Isle of Saints and Sages? Gerald speaks a few times to how the Irish run their political affairs, and I'm in closing going to pay attention to a few of these sound bites from his text with the snarky title on this slide. In some, we're doing the Irish a favor, really. So let's look at the outlandish way that they pick their local kings, is what I presume this custom is describing. So it's depicted there in that image, and then also described here, a quote that I just have to read in all of its wonderful, glorious depravity. When the whole people of that land has been gathered in one place, and so this is speaking of one locale in Ireland, a white mare is brought forward into the middle of the assembly. He who is to be inaugurated, not as a chief, but as a beast, not as a king, but as an outlaw, has bestial intercourse with her before all, professing himself to be a beast also. So, of course, he's kind of flipping the script here. This is a way that they elect a local person, but he's flipping the language around, as you can see. The mare is then killed, immediately cut up in pieces, then boiled in water. A bath is prepared for the man afterwards in the same water. He sits in the bath, surrounded by all his people, and all, he and they, eat the meat of the mare which is brought to them. He quaffs and drinks of the broth in which he is bathed, not in any cup or using his hand, but just dipping his mouth into it round about him. So, wow, what graphic detail, not even using a cup. So we've got quite a few of those boundaries that I've been talking about in binary pairs getting crossed. So human and animal, their local leader really himself is something like a beast. He not only has sex with the beast, but then also eats the beast and is declared to be a beast, even though he's the equivalent of a local Irish, quote unquote official. And then this water that is used to boil the animal to cook it, cooking water then used as bath water that's then drunk by this quote unquote king, not even using a cup, so drinking his own bath water. Gerald is really trying to maximize the gross out factor in describing this outlandish way the Irish go about confirming a kingship. This slide is titled That Explains It. So here we see Gerald reverse engineering English relationships with Ireland, a picture of Henry II from a manuscript of Gerald's text. So he gets a few noteworthy mentions at the very, very end of the text, and of course at the beginning. So let's keep in mind for whom this text was written. As I've said, Gerald goes to Ireland with a strong case of confirmation bias. He has to justify English dominion over Ireland, which would last for 800 years. So from the deposition of the last of the High Kings, Rory O'Connor, in 1169, up until the 20th century, there is some kind of English lordship over Ireland, and some of that more recent history is probably familiar to some of you who have, I know a lot of Americans have Irish lineage, I myself do. As I say, he goes so far as to reverse engineer an early English claim to Ireland. So I should note that a lot of that quote unquote prehistory that he gives is legendary, even though it is being advertised as history at the time. So we'll talk more about this when we get to the Mort D'Arthur, but essentially their idea of history involved stories about great men. It's not necessarily factually true, but it conveys capital T truths. So one such factoid that he clamps down upon is that of about the early British king Gurguintius, who lives before Christ. He provides for Spanish explorers to go and take the country on England's behalf. So people aren't even really sure when this British king lived. I couldn't get a firmer date than a few centuries before Christ. So you think, gee, did this person even live? And do we have any kind of really official edict for his, you're taking over the country at this time? Yet in another pseudo-historical move, Gerald says that the Irish paid tribute to King Arthur, who, spoiler alert for the text that we're reading later in the semester, Mort Arthur, was not actually a king, even though he is called a king throughout the Middle Ages, mostly from the 11th century on. So after those histories of Britain start to get written, and I'll talk more about that later in the semester, but they would be known as your pseudo history to us, but they're just, you know, stories about great men, usually men. Arthur was, in fact, like the historical Arthur, a native warrior who fought against the invading Germanic tribes in the late 5th century, early 6th century. We've got kind of like fast and loose dates about even when he lived, but he wasn't a king. He's just promoted to the stature of king after the fact by historians who are looking for quote unquote great stories about great men. So we know that England is on the margins of what was the known world at the time, at least the way that maps were drawn. So it's far to the west. It's the angels on the edge of the world, as I've called them. In the last 3 chapters of his text, as Gerald lavishes lots of praise upon Henry II, working with this paradigm that I've set up for y'all, I feel like he's trying to make England sound like the center of the world. So follow me in thought here for a second. He claims that the petty kings of the West, so that's Ireland, flew to your command as little birds to alight. Didn't go down quite that easily, but nonetheless, Gerald is trying to praise Henry as much as he can. Then he speaks of Henry's conquest to the east, which, as the string of question marks there suggests, I'm not sure exactly what tangible accomplishment he's talking about, or whether this was just a plan. It's not familiar to me, and in hunting around, I'm not sure what he's getting at. It says there, you postponed your eastern victories in Asia and in Spain. He says in the text that Henry, of course, wants to spread Christianity everywhere, which is an alibi for conquest throughout the Middle Ages. Don't know at the Asia and the Spain, but Henry does have possession over much of France. And so if you look here, Ireland is to the west of England, and then France to the east. So this is the greatest extent of the Angevin Empire that Henry is a member of, and ultimately these English possessions on the continent in France would be fodder for the 100 Years' War that happens from 1336 to 1453. So that's a little ways down the road, but as you can see, the history of the two countries is entangled, just even here on the map. And Henry does have land on both sides of him that is under his dominion. So the spotted areas are areas that he controls and has relations with, and then here is official parts of the Angevin Empire. And so England and Henry's official seat of power is in the middle of this conquered territory. So thinking about how we've been working with centers and margins, I couldn't help but think that the ultimate flattery to Henry would be to describe England as central rather than marginal.